On your knees. Now. The command cut through the afternoon air like a blade, sharp, public, undeniable, and every conversation in the upscale downtown parking structure died in an instant as Marcus Ellington stood still beside a midnight black $320,000 luxury coupe. The kind of car that didn't just whisper wealth but announced it without apology. Yet somehow, in that moment, none of that mattered because all anyone saw was a black man in a fitted charcoal t-shirt and dark jeans being surrounded by uniformed officers, as if he didn't belong anywhere near something like that. As if the car itself was evidence against him instead of proof of everything he had built. And Marcus didn't flinch. Not when the first officer stepped closer. Not when another circled behind him. Not even when a third reached for his wrist with a confidence that didn't come from truth but from assumption. And somewhere in the background a phone camera clicked on. Then another. Then 5 more. Until the quiet hum of engines and distant traffic was replaced by the soft, constant buzz of people recording what they already felt was wrong but couldn't yet explain. And Marcus slowly lifted his gaze, not to the officers, but to the reflection of himself in the polished side panel of the car, calm, steady, almost detached, like he had seen this moment before in a different life, in a different version of himself. And maybe he had, because this wasn't new. It just wore a different uniform this time. "Sir, step away from the vehicle," the officer repeated, louder now, like volume could replace certainty. And Marcus finally spoke, his voice low, controlled, carrying just enough weight to cut through the noise without raising it. "Run the plate," he said. And the words didn't sound like a request. They sounded like a mirror, one that forced the room to look at itself whether it wanted to or not. But the officer didn't move, didn't check, didn't verify. Because this wasn't about information, it was about perception. And perception had already made up its mind the second Marcus stepped out of that driver's seat alone. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change, and we're glad you're here. Now back to Marcus Ellington, because the situation didn't pause, it escalated. The echo of approaching sirens bouncing off the concrete pillars as 2 more patrol cars rolled into the structure, red and blue lights washing over the glossy surface of the car like a warning that didn't belong there. And people started gathering, not too close, but close enough to witness, close enough to feel that quiet tension building in their chest, the kind that comes when something feels off but hasn't fully broken yet. And Marcus stood in the center of it all, hands visible, posture relaxed. Not because he was comfortable, but because he refused to give the moment what it was asking for, panic. And a young woman near the elevator raised her phone higher, whispering to her live stream, "This doesn't look right," her voice trembling just enough to carry truth. And another man beside her nodded, muttering under his breath, "That's his car." But no one stepped forward yet, not fully, because authority was still speaking louder than instinct. And then the shift came, not loud, not dramatic. Just the sound of a different engine pulling in, slower, heavier, deliberate, and the officers straightened slightly as the driver's door opened and Police Chief Daniel Reeves stepped out, his presence filling the space before he even said a word, tall, composed, the kind of authority that didn't question itself. And his eyes locked onto Marcus in a single glance, a glance that lasted less than a second but carried a decision already made. "What do we have?" he asked. And the first officer responded quickly, almost eagerly. "Possible stolen vehicle. Suspect refusing to cooperate." And the word suspect hung in the air like a label being stamped without evidence. And Marcus tilted his head slightly, not in confusion, but in recognition, like he had just heard something familiar, something outdated, something predictable. And the chief stepped closer, his tone colder now, sharper. "Sir, you're being detained until we verify ownership." And again, no check, no system, no verification, just procedure shaped by assumption. And Marcus let out a slow breath, the kind that doesn't signal defeat but patience. And he looked around, not at the officers, but at the people, at the phones, at the quiet shift happening in the crowd as more eyes began to question what they were seeing. And somewhere in that crowd, someone said it out loud, "He hasn't done anything." And that was the moment the energy changed, subtle, but real, because truth doesn't need volume. It just needs space. And Marcus took one small step forward, Not aggressive, not defiant, just enough to reclaim his position beside the car, and the chief's voice snapped back instantly. Don't move. And Marcus stopped, not because he was told to, but because he had already made his next move in his head, and it didn't involve arguing, it involved timing. And the officers exchanged glances, unsure now, because something about him didn't match the script they were used to. No raised voice, no resistance, no panic, just stillness, and that stillness was louder than anything else in the room. And Marcus reached slowly into his pocket, not suddenly, not carelessly, but with intention, pulling out his phone, and one officer shifted, ready to react, but Marcus didn't look at him. He looked straight at the chief, and for a brief second, the two of them stood there, not as officer and suspect, but as two men on opposite sides of a truth that hadn't been revealed yet. And Marcus pressed a single contact, lifting the phone to his ear, and when he spoke, his voice didn't carry urgency, it carried certainty. "It's Marcus," he said, pausing just long enough for the weight of the name to exist without explanation. "Start the audit." And the chief frowned slightly, not understanding. "Not yet." And the officers looked between them, the crowd leaning in, the live stream numbers climbing, the moment stretching, tightening, building towards something none of them could fully see yet. And Marcus lowered the phone, slipping it back into his pocket with the same calm precision. And then he looked at the chief again, eyes steady, voice even. "You might want to stop this," he said. And the chief let out a short, dismissive breath, a smirk forming like confidence built on incomplete information. "Or what?" he replied, and Marcus didn't answer immediately, because timing was everything, and the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was loaded. And then, finally, he spoke, not louder, not sharper, just clearer, because in about 60 seconds, he said, his gaze never breaking, "Your entire department is going to realize exactly who you're talking to." And somewhere behind them, a phone buzzed, then another, then a radio crackled faintly, and the first ripple of something much bigger than this parking lot began to move. The first radio crackle came from the officer standing closest to Marcus, a sharp burst of static followed by a voice that was trying too hard to stay controlled. "Unit 12, confirm the vehicle identification number again." And the officer blinked, glancing down at his tablet, as if the numbers had suddenly changed on their own, as if reality itself had shifted without permission. And for the first time since the scene began, hesitation crept in, small but visible, like a crack in glass that had just started to spread, and Marcus saw it, not with satisfaction, but with recognition, because he knew exactly what came next, not chaos, not shouting, but truth moving quietly through systems that did not lie. And the chief noticed it too, his posture tightening just slightly as he turned toward the officer. "What is the delay?" he asked, his voice still firm but now edged with something less certain. And the officer swallowed, eyes flicking between the screen and Marcus. "The plate matches," he said, and the words landed softly, but they carried weight, because matching was not supposed to happen in this version of the story, not in the one they had already started writing in their heads. And the chief's jaw shifted, a small movement, but enough to show that the narrative was slipping. "Then verify ownership," he replied quickly, almost too quickly, like he was trying to outrun what was already catching up. And the officer nodded, tapping rapidly, the glow of the screen reflecting in his eyes as more data populated, more confirmation, more truth, and around them the crowd leaned in closer, the phone steadier now, no longer just curious, but attentive, because something was changing, something undeniable. And Marcus stood exactly where he had been, not moving, not speaking, just watching the process unfold the way he had designed processes to unfold for years, clean, efficient, unbiased. When allowed to function without interference, and a second radio chimed in, louder this time. "Chief Reeves, dispatch is requesting clarification on the status." And the chief grabbed his radio, pressing it with controlled force. "Stand by," he said, but his voice no longer carried the same certainty, because the ground beneath him was shifting, not physically, but structurally. And Marcus tilted his head slightly, his gaze moving briefly to the car again. The same reflection, the same stillness, but now there was something else there, something sharper, not anger, not even frustration, just the quiet presence of someone who knew the ending before the scene was finished. And a young man near the back of the crowd whispered to his friend, They are about to mess up. And his friend nodded slowly, eyes fixed on Marcus, because there was something about him that did not match the situation they were trying to place him in. And then the officer holding the tablet spoke again, this time slower, more deliberate. The vehicle is registered to Ellington Automotive Holdings, he said, and the name hung in the air like a key that no one had used yet, and the chief's eyes narrowed. And the driver? He asked, and the officer hesitated for just a fraction of a second, but it was enough for everyone to feel it. Marcus Ellington, he said, and silence followed, not complete, but heavy, like the air itself had thickened, and someone in the crowd let out a quiet breath they did not realize they had been holding, and the live stream chat exploded with comments, with questions, with recognition, because that name was not unfamiliar, not in this city, not in this industry, not to anyone who had paid attention to the skyline changing over the past decade. And the chief's expression hardened, not in confidence, but in resistance, because accepting the truth meant undoing everything he had just done in front of an audience that was no longer passive. And he stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and Marcus, his voice lower now, controlled. If that is the case, then we will sort this out, he said. But the words felt smaller than before, less authoritative, more defensive, and Marcus finally shifted his stance. Just slightly, enough to face him directly, and when he spoke, it was not loud, but it carried. You already did sort it out, he said, and the simplicity of the statement cut deeper than any raised voice could have, and the chief's lips pressed together, searching for control, for a way to reframe the moment. We are following procedure, he replied, and Marcus's eyes held his, steady, unblinking. Procedure does not ignore facts, he said. And somewhere behind them, another phone buzzed, then another, and one of the officers stepped back slightly as his own device lit up with an incoming message, his eyes scanning quickly before widening just a fraction, and he looked toward the chief, uncertain now in a way he had not been before. Sir. Internal just flagged this, he said, holding up the screen, and the chief glanced at it. Irritation flickering across his face before something else replaced it, something colder, something more serious, because whatever was on that screen was not local, not routine. It was higher, and Marcus watched it all without interruption, because this was the moment he had been waiting for, not the confrontation, not the accusation, but the correction, and the officer swallowed again, reading carefully. It says, "Priority alert from city oversight," he said, his voice quieter now, almost respectful without realizing it, and the chief's grip on the radio tightened. That is not relevant, he snapped, but the words lacked conviction, because relevance was no longer his to decide, and Marcus exhaled slowly, his gaze shifting briefly to the crowd, to the people who had stayed, who had watched, who had not turned away, and then back to the chief. It is relevant, he said, and the statement did not sound like a challenge, it sounded like a conclusion, and the officer's radio crackled again, louder this time, impossible to ignore. Chief Reeves, you are instructed to pause all enforcement actions related to that individual until further notice. And the message echoed slightly in the concrete space, repeating itself in the silence that followed, and the chief did not respond immediately, because responding meant acknowledging, and acknowledging meant losing control of a situation he had believed he owned just minutes ago. And Marcus stood there, hands still visible, posture unchanged, but everything around him had shifted, the authority that once surrounded him now hesitating, recalculating, and the crowd, once unsure, now watching with a different kind of attention, the kind reserved for moments that would be remembered, not because they were loud, but because they revealed something deeper. And Marcus spoke one more time, his voice calm, precise, leaving no room for interpretation. You should listen, he said, and for the first time since he stepped into that parking structure, no one interrupted him. The silence did not break all at once, it fractured slowly, like something under pressure finally giving way, and Chief Reeves stood there with the radio still in his hand, the command echoing in his ears longer than it should have, longer than he wanted it to, because it was not just an instruction, it was a shift in control, and control was something he had built his entire career around never losing in public, especially not like this, not in front of officers, not in front of civilians. and certainly not in front of a man he had already decided did not belong in this space. And yet here they were, the entire scene recalibrating around a truth he could no longer ignore, but still refused to accept. Stand by. He repeated into the radio, but the words sounded thinner now, like they were coming from someone trying to hold a line that had already been crossed, and the officer beside him shifted again, glancing down at his screen as another notification came through. More confirmation, more layers of authority stacking above them, and the crowd felt it, that invisible pressure turning into something tangible, because the tone had changed, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, and Marcus Ellington stood in the center of it all like an anchor, unmoved, unshaken, his presence now commanding attention not because he demanded it, but because everything else had begun to fall out of alignment around him, and a woman near the front lowered her phone slightly, whispering to her stream, "They are backing off." Her voice filled with that mix of disbelief and recognition that comes when something hidden becomes visible in real time, and Marcus did not look at her, did not acknowledge the cameras, because this moment was not about performance, it was about exposure, and the chief took one step closer again, slower this time, more deliberate, as if proximity could restore authority. "You should have identified yourself," he said, his tone attempting to regain structure, to rebuild a narrative where he was still in control, and Marcus met his gaze without hesitation. "You should have verified before you acted," he replied, and the exchange landed clean, balanced, like two statements placed side by side for everyone to judge without commentary, and the chief's jaw tightened, because he knew the difference between accusation and fact, and this was the latter, and facts were harder to dismiss when they came without emotion, and one of the officers behind him cleared his throat slightly, not loud enough to interrupt, but enough to signal discomfort, the kind that spreads quietly through a group when certainty disappears. And another radio call came in, sharper now, more direct. "Chief Reeves, confirm compliance with the directive." And this time there was no room to ignore it, no space to reinterpret, and the chief lowered the radio slowly, his grip loosening just enough to show that something had shifted inside him. Not acceptance, not yet, but awareness, and Marcus watched him carefully, not with hostility, but with precision, because this was the point where decisions mattered more than words, and the chief finally spoke, not to Marcus, but to his officers. "Release the hold," he said, and the instruction was quiet, almost reluctant, but it carried, and the officer closest to Marcus hesitated for just a second before stepping back, creating space where there had been pressure, and the change was immediate, visible, like a boundary, being redrawn in real time, and the crowd reacted with a low murmur, not loud applause, not dramatic reaction, just that collective shift of energy when tension begins to dissolve, and Marcus lowered his hands slowly, not rushed, not exaggerated, just enough to acknowledge the change without making it the focus, and for a brief moment, everything paused, not because the situation was over, but because it had transformed into something else entirely, something more complex, more revealing, and the chief looked around, taking in the phones, the faces, the officers who were now waiting for direction instead of enforcing it, and he realized something he had not considered when this began, that this was no longer a private interaction, it was a record, a moment captured from multiple angles, multiple perspectives, and Marcus saw that realization settle in, saw the shift from authority to calculation, and he spoke again, his voice calm, steady, carrying just enough weight to anchor the moment. "This did not start with a question," he said, and the chief's eyes flicked back to him. "It started with an assumption." Marcus continued, and no one interrupted, not because they could not, but because there was nothing to argue with, and the words hung there, simple, direct, impossible to dismiss, and somewhere in the back of the crowd, a man nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had known but had never seen this clearly before, and the officer with the tablet spoke again, quieter now, more careful. "Everything checks out," he said, and this time the statement did not feel like information, it felt like correction, like a system finally catching up to reality, and the chief exhaled slowly, his shoulders dropping just enough to show the weight of the moment settling in, and he turned slightly, looking at his officers, at the scene, at the cameras, and then back to Marcus, and for the first time, there was no command in his voice, no directive, just a measured tone that sounded almost unfamiliar. "You are free to go," he said, and the words, while expected, did not resolve anything. They did not erase what had already happened, and Marcus did not move immediately, because leaving was not the point, not anymore. And he took a step forward, closing the distance again. But this time there was no resistance, no tension, just space. And he looked directly at the chief, his voice low, precise. "This is not about me walking away," he said. And the chief held his gaze, uncertain now in a way that had nothing to do with procedure, and Marcus continued. "This is about what happens when you think you already know who belongs." And the words settled into the space like a final piece of a puzzle, completing a picture no one in that parking structure could ignore anymore. And the cameras stayed up, the crowd stayed still. And for the first time since the scene began, the silence did not feel tense. It felt revealing. For a moment no one moved. Not the officers, not the crowd, not even Marcus. Because what had just been said did not feel like the end of something. It felt like the beginning of something far more uncomfortable. Something that could not be undone with a simple statement or a quiet dismissal. And Chief Reeves stood there facing him, the weight of the situation settling deeper now, not just as a mistake, but as a pattern that had been exposed in a place where it could not be hidden. And Marcus held his gaze without aggression, without pride, just clarity, the kind that forces people to confront what they would rather ignore. And somewhere to the left a phone chimed loudly, breaking the stillness for a split second before being silenced. But the interruption was enough to remind everyone that this moment was already moving beyond this parking structure, already traveling through screens, through conversations, through interpretations that would not be controlled by anyone standing here. And Marcus shifted slightly, not away, but forward, his presence now less about defense and more about definition. And he spoke again, his tone unchanged. "You had every tool you needed to get this right," he said, and the words landed heavier than before because now they were backed by everything that had already unfolded. And the chief inhaled slowly, his posture tightening, searching for something to say that would restore balance. "We responded to a report," he replied. But even as the words left his mouth, they sounded incomplete, like a sentence missing its most important part. And Marcus did not interrupt him, did not challenge him immediately. He let the statement sit there, exposed, before responding. "And you stopped there," he said. And that was the difference, not loud, not dramatic, just precise. And the officers nearby shifted again, their attention no longer fixed on Marcus as a subject, but on the exchange itself, as if they were now witnessing something they had not been trained for. And the crowd leaned in slightly, not physically closer, but mentally, emotionally, because this was no longer about a car or a misunderstanding. It was about something broader, something that had been quietly accepted until now. And Marcus glanced briefly at the car again, the reflection still steady, still calm, and for a brief second, the present blurred with memory, not in a dramatic flash, but in a subtle overlay, a younger version of himself standing in a different lot, a different car, years ago, the same look from a different officer, the same question asked without asking, the same assumption delivered without evidence. And back then, there had been no audience, no cameras, no system ready to respond. Just silence. And Marcus blinked once, returning fully to the present. And the difference between then and now was not just time. It was power. It was structure. It was preparation. And he looked back at the chief, his voice steady. "This is not the first time this happens," he said. And the statement was not directed at one man. It was directed at the system standing behind him. And the chief's expression shifted again. This time not defensive, but guarded, because he understood what was being said, even if he did not want to admit it out loud. And one of the officers behind him lowered his gaze slightly, the weight of the moment settling in a different way for him, more personal, more reflective. And the woman who had been live streaming earlier spoke softly again, this time not to her audience, but to herself. "He is right," she whispered, and the words carried just enough to be heard by those closest to her. And Marcus continued, not raising his voice, not rushing his words. "You saw the car," he said. "You saw me." And he paused, just long enough for the contrast to form on its own. "And you decided the story before you checked the facts." And the simplicity of it stripped away any complexity the situation had tried to hide behind. And the chief looked around briefly, not in search of support, but in awareness of how exposed the moment had become. How many angles were capturing it? How many interpretations were forming? In real time, and for the first time since he arrived, he did not speak immediately. He allowed the silence to exist, and that silence said more than any defense could have, and Marcus took a small step back, not retreating, but resetting the space between them, and his posture relaxed slightly, not because the tension was gone, but because the point had been made, and the officer with the tablet lowered it completely now, no longer needing to verify anything, because everything that mattered had already been confirmed, and the crowd began to shift subtly, some lowering their phones, others still holding them steady, unwilling to miss what might come next, and a man near the back spoke up, not loudly, but clearly enough. So what happens now? And the question hung there, directed at no one and everyone at the same time, and Marcus turned his head slightly toward the voice, acknowledging it without fully facing it. And then he looked back at the chief, because the answer did not belong to the crowd. It belonged to the system that had just been exposed, and the chief straightened his shoulders, the instinct to regain authority still present, but now tempered by the reality of the situation, and he spoke carefully, choosing each word with more attention than before. "We will document the incident," he said, and Marcus nodded once, not in agreement, but in recognition of the process, and then he added, his voice just as calm, "Documentation does not fix behavior." And again, there was no argument, no immediate response, just that quiet understanding settling deeper into the space, and the chief exhaled slowly, the tension in his stance easing just enough to show that he was no longer trying to control the moment, but to navigate it. And Marcus glanced once more at the crowd, at the faces, at the phones, and then back to the chief. And when he spoke again, his tone carried something new, not just clarity, but direction. "This is where it changes," he said, and the words did not sound like a threat. They sounded like a decision already made, and somewhere in the distance, beyond the structure, another siren echoed faintly, but it did not belong to this moment anymore, because what was happening here had already moved beyond enforcement, beyond procedure, into something else entirely, something that could not be reset with a simple report or a quiet exit. And Marcus reached into his pocket again, pulling out his phone with the same controlled movement, and as the screen lit up, the reflection of it in his eyes was steady, focused, and he tapped once, bringing it to his ear, and when he spoke, his voice remained calm, but the weight behind it had shifted. "Proceed to phase 2, he said, and the words were not loud, but they carried through the space like a signal, and this time, the change did not start with the officers, it started somewhere else entirely. The shift did not arrive with noise, it arrived with precision, the kind that moves through systems before it ever touches the surface. And Marcus lowered his phone slowly, not looking at it again, because whatever he had just triggered was already in motion, already unfolding somewhere beyond the concrete walls of that parking structure. And Chief Reeves felt it before he understood it, that subtle change in the air when authority begins to come from somewhere else, somewhere higher, somewhere he does not control. And one of the officers' radios lit up again, not with static this time, but with a clear incoming signal that cut through the space with quiet urgency. "Command to Chief Reeves, confirm status." Immediately, and the tone was different now, not routine, not casual, it carried weight, expectation, and the officer glanced at the chief, unsure whether to respond or wait, because the hierarchy had just shifted in a way none of them were prepared for, and Marcus stood still, watching it happen without interruption, because this was the part most people never saw, not the confrontation, but the correction, not the accusation, but the unraveling. And the chief pressed his radio, his voice controlled but tighter than before. "This is Reeves, situation contained," he said, but the words felt incomplete the moment they left his mouth, because containment was no longer accurate, not when the situation had expanded beyond his reach, and the response came instantly, sharper now. "Negative, Chief. Escalate to full review. Oversight is requesting immediate compliance." And the word oversight landed differently, heavier, because it did not belong to his chain of command, it belonged above it, outside it. And for the first time since this began, the chief did not respond right away, because responding meant acknowledging a level of authority he could not redirect, and Marcus saw the hesitation, not as weakness, but as reality catching up, and he spoke again, his voice calm, measured. "It is already moving," he said, and the statement was not a warning, it was a fact, and the crowd felt it too. The tension shifting from confrontation to anticipation, because something bigger than this moment was unfolding, something that would not stop at this parking lot. And a man near the front checked his phone, his eyes widening slightly as he read something that had just appeared. "It is online," he said quietly, almost to himself, and the woman beside him leaned in, her own screen lighting up with the same content, the same footage, the same moment now circulating beyond the people who were physically present. And Marcus did not look at the screens, he did not need to, because he already knew how information moved, how quickly it spread when it was real, when it was undeniable, and the chief's radio crackled again, this time with a different voice, one that carried authority without needing volume. "Chief Reeves, this is city oversight. You are instructed to stand down and await further directive." And the words settled into the space like a final confirmation, not of error, but of consequence. And the chief's posture shifted, not dramatically, but enough to show that something had changed internally, the resistance giving way to calculation, and he lowered the radio slowly, his eyes moving back to Marcus, who stood exactly where he had been, unchanged, unshaken. And in that moment the difference between them was no longer about position or title, it was about control, and control had just moved. And the officers around them began to adjust, their stance less rigid now, their focus no longer fixed on Marcus as a subject, but on the situation as a whole, as if they were now part of something they had not been briefed on. And the crowd continued to watch, phones still raised, but the energy had shifted from tension to realization, because what they were witnessing was not just a misunderstanding being corrected, it was a system being exposed in real time. And Marcus took a slow breath, his gaze steady, and for a brief second, the memory returned again, not as a distraction, but as a reminder, a younger version of himself standing in silence, no cameras, no oversight, no system stepping in, just a moment that ended without resolution, without accountability, and then it faded, replaced by the present, where everything was different, not because the behavior had changed, but because the response had. And Marcus looked at the chief, his voice calm, precise. "This is what accountability looks like," he said, and the words were not loud, but they carried through the space with clarity, and the chief did not respond immediately, because there was nothing to argue with, not anymore. And one of the officers shifted again, glancing at his phone as another notification appeared, his expression tightening slightly as he read it. "Sir," he said, turning toward the chief. "Internal just flagged multiple incidents tied to this unit." And the statement hung in the air like a second layer of truth, one that extended beyond this moment into something deeper, something systemic. And the chief's eyes flicked to the officer, then back to Marcus. And for the first time, there was no defense forming, no narrative being built, just awareness settling in. And Marcus did not react with surprise, did not ask for details, because this was part of what he had already set in motion, not as revenge, but as exposure. And the officer continued, his voice quieter now, more careful. "They are pulling body cam logs and prior reports," he said, and the implication was clear. This was no longer about a single interaction, it was about a pattern, and the crowd felt it too. The shift from isolated incident to something larger, something that would not be resolved with a simple apology or a closed report. And Marcus took one small step to the side, repositioning himself next to the car again, not to reclaim it, but to redefine the space, and he placed his hand lightly on the roof, the gesture simple, almost symbolic, and he looked back at the chief, his voice steady. "You thought this was about a car," he said, and the chief held his gaze, silent, because he already understood what was coming next. And Marcus continued, "It never was." And the words settled into the space like a final piece of clarity, and somewhere in the distance, beyond the structure, the faint hum of the city continued, unchanged, unaware, but inside that parking structure, everything had shifted, not with force, not with volume, but with truth. And Marcus reached into his pocket once more, not urgently, not dramatically, just deliberately, and as his phone lit up again, the reflection in his eyes remained calm, focused, and he spoke quietly into it. "Keep it running," he said, and the response on the other end was immediate, though unheard by anyone else. And the effect was already visible, not in what had happened, but in what was about to unfold. The next shift did not come from a voice or a command. It came from movement, subtle at first, then undeniable, as two black SUVs rolled slowly into the far end of the parking structure. Their presence quiet but deliberate, engines low, controlled, and every officer in the space noticed immediately because they were not marked units. They did not belong to the usual flow of patrol or response. And Chief Reeves turned his head slightly, his eyes narrowing as he tried to place them within a system he understood, but they did not fit, not into his command, not into his expectation. And Marcus saw them too, not with surprise, but with recognition, like a signal arriving exactly when it was supposed to. And the crowd followed the motion instinctively, phones shifting, lenses adjusting, capturing the new arrival. As the vehicles came to a stop with precise spacing, doors opening in sequence, and three individuals stepped out, not rushed, not aggressive, but purposeful, dressed in dark suits that carried a different kind of authority, one that did not rely on uniforms or raised voices. And the energy in the space shifted again, this time deeper, more structural, because this was no longer about local response. It was about oversight becoming visible, and one of the officers near the chief leaned slightly toward him, his voice low, uncertain. "Sir, that looks like city compliance." And the chief did not respond immediately, because he already knew. He just had not expected it to arrive this fast, not in person, not like this. And Marcus remained where he was, his hand still resting lightly on the car, his posture unchanged, because everything unfolding now was not reactive. It was the continuation of a process he had already set in motion, and the first of the suited individuals approached her, pace steady, her expression composed, and she stopped just a few feet from the chief, not addressing him as a subordinate, but not deferring either, her voice clear, controlled. "Chief Reeves," she said, and the way she said his name carried recognition without deference, authority without escalation, and the chief straightened slightly, instinctively adjusting his stance. "Yes," he replied, and she nodded once, a minimal acknowledgement. "We are initiating an immediate compliance review of this incident," she continued, and the words landed with finality, not as a suggestion, not as a discussion, but as a decision already made. And the officers nearby exchanged glances, their uncertainty growing as the structure of the situation continued to shift beyond what they had prepared for. And Marcus watched quietly, his gaze steady, because this was the moment where visibility turned into accountability. And the woman turned her attention briefly toward him, her expression softening just enough to signal awareness, not of his identity, but of the situation as a whole. And then back to the chief. "All body camera footage, dispatch logs, and prior incident reports connected to this unit are being pulled in real time," she said, and the chief's jaw tightened slightly, not in defiance, but in recognition of what that meant, because once those systems were engaged, nothing could be adjusted, nothing could be reframed. It was all recorded, all preserved, all visible. And a second suited individual stepped forward, holding a tablet, the screen already active, already displaying data that was moving faster than anyone in the parking structure could process. And he spoke calmly, almost clinically. "We have identified multiple prior stops with similar escalation patterns," he said, and the phrase "similar escalation patterns" echoed in the space, not loud, but heavy, because it suggested something larger than a single mistake, something repeated, something embedded. And the crowd reacted with a low murmur, not surprised, but confirmed, like hearing something they had suspected but never seen acknowledged this clearly. And Marcus shifted his weight slightly, his eyes moving briefly across the faces around him, the witnesses, the observers, the ones who had chosen to stay, and then back to the scene unfolding in front of him. And the chief exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just enough to show the weight of the moment settling in. Fully now, not just as a misstep, but as exposure. And he spoke carefully, choosing his words with more precision than before. "We will cooperate fully," he said, and the statement was correct, but it came too late to carry authority, because cooperation was no longer a choice. It was an expectation, and the woman nodded once, acknowledging the response without validating it. "You will remain on site until the initial review is complete," she said, and the instruction was clear, firm, leaving no room for interpretation, and the chief did not argue, because there was nothing to argue against, not in this moment, not with this level of oversight present, and the officers around him adjusted again, their posture shifting from enforcement to observation, their role changing in real time as the situation moved beyond their control, and Marcus finally moved his hand from the car, letting it fall naturally to his side, and he took one small step forward, not to confront, not to escalate, but to be present, fully, visibly, and the woman turned toward him again, her expression now more direct. "Mr. Ellington," she said, and the use of his name, spoken clearly, without hesitation, without doubt, marked the final shift, the moment where identity replaced assumption completely, and Marcus met her gaze, his voice calm, steady. "I appreciate the response time," he said, and the words were simple, but they carried weight, because they acknowledged not just the action, but the necessity of it, and she inclined her head slightly. "We take these matters seriously," she replied, and the exchange, brief as it was, reframed the entire scene, not as a confrontation, but as a correction in progress, and the crowd felt it, the transition from tension to accountability, from uncertainty to clarity, and one of the live stream viewers shouted from somewhere in the back, "This is how it should be," and the statement, though not directed at anyone specific, resonated through the space, and Marcus glanced once more at the chief, not with judgment, not with triumph, but with clarity, and he spoke one final time in that moment, his voice low, precise. "This is where the story changes," he said, and the words settled into the space like a marker, dividing what had been from what would come next, and as the compliance team began to move, to organize, to document, the parking structure no longer felt like a place of accusation. It felt like a place of exposure, and Marcus stood at the center of it, not as a suspect, not as a victim, but as the catalyst for something that was now too visible to ignore. The air did not return to normal. It recalibrated, every movement now measured, every word now carrying weight, and the compliance team spread out with quiet precision, not rushing, not hesitating, just working, and that was what made it different, because this was not reaction, it was procedure finally applied without bias, and Marcus Ellington stood at the center of it, no longer surrounded, no longer questioned, but not disengaged either, because leaving would have been easier, and this moment was not about easy, it was about completion, and Chief Reeves remained where he was, his posture upright, but no longer dominant, his presence now part of the scene instead of controlling it, and one of the compliance officers stepped closer to him, holding a tablet angled slightly upward. "Chief, we will need your statement regarding the initial decision to escalate," she said, her tone neutral, not accusatory, not forgiving, just factual, and the chief nodded once, slow, deliberate, as if acknowledging the shift not just in authority, but in accountability. "We received a report of a stolen vehicle," he began, his voice steady but lacking the earlier certainty, and the officer did not interrupt, did not guide, she simply listened, because the record mattered more than the tone, and Marcus watched quietly, his eyes steady, because this was the part that most people never saw, the unraveling not in public confrontation, but in quiet documentation, and the crowd had not dispersed, not yet, because something about this moment held them there, not out of curiosity anymore, but out of recognition, like they were witnessing something that needed to be seen through to the end, and a young man near the front lowered his phone slightly, whispering, "They are not leaving," and the woman beside him nodded. "Because it is not over," she replied, and she was right, because what had started as a single interaction had expanded into something larger, something systemic, and one of the compliance officers turned toward Marcus again, her expression composed. "Mr. Ellington, we will also need your account of the sequence of events," she said, and Marcus inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the request, not as a formality, but as part of the process, and he stepped forward just enough to position himself clearly within the space, his voice calm. "I exited my vehicle," he said, and within seconds I was approached with the assumption that it did not belong to me. And the simplicity of the statement carried more weight than any elaboration could have, because it stripped the situation down to its core, and the officer nodded, entering the information, her movements efficient, precise, and Marcus continued, not adding emotion, not adding emphasis, just facts. No verification was conducted before escalation, he said, and again, no one interrupted, because there was nothing to challenge, and Chief Reeves shifted slightly, his eyes moving briefly to Marcus, then back to the compliance officer, as if measuring the distance between what had happened and how it was now being recorded. And the second compliance officer spoke again, his voice steady. We have already confirmed that the vehicle registration matched immediately upon initial scan, he said, and the statement settled into the space like a final confirmation of what had been missed, not by the system, but by the people operating it. And the chief exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just enough to show the weight of that realization. And for a brief moment, no one spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that mattered had already been said, and Marcus glanced once more at the car, the reflection still steady, still calm, and for a split second, the memory surfaced again, not as a distraction, but as context, the same assumption years ago, the same silence that followed, the absence of correction, and then it faded, replaced by the present, where the system was responding, where the moment was being documented, where the silence had been replaced by record. And Marcus looked back at the compliance officer, his voice unchanged. This is not about a mistake, he said. And the officer paused her typing for just a fraction of a second, her eyes lifting to meet his. It is about a pattern, he continued, and the word pattern carried through the space, connecting what had just been confirmed with what was still being uncovered, and the second officer nodded slightly. We are identifying that now, he said, and the confirmation did not escalate the moment. It grounded it, because now it was no longer speculation, it was data, and the crowd reacted again, not loudly, but collectively, a subtle shift of understanding moving through them. And one of the officers who had been present from the beginning lowered his gaze, his posture changing in a way that suggested reflection, not on the moment alone, but on something broader, something personal, and Marcus saw it, not with judgment, but with awareness, because change did not always begin with systems. Sometimes it began with individuals recognizing what they had been part of, and the compliance officer finished entering the initial statements, her tablet screen filling with information that would not disappear, would not be rewritten, and she looked back at the chief, her tone unchanged. You are being placed on temporary administrative hold pending full review, she said, and the words landed quietly, but they carried finality, because they were not a suggestion. They were a decision already executed, and the chief did not react immediately, not with protest, not with denial, just a slight tightening of his jaw as the reality settled in, and he nodded once, a small movement that acknowledged what had just been said, and the officers around him shifted again, their stance no longer aligned with him, but with the process now unfolding, and Marcus stood there, watching it all, not with satisfaction, not with triumph, but with clarity, because this was never about one man, it was about what that man represented in that moment. And the woman who had been live streaming earlier spoke again, this time louder, her voice carrying through the space. This is accountability, she said, and no one corrected her, no one disagreed, because the word fit, it matched what they were seeing, and Marcus took one final look at the chief, his expression steady, his voice calm. This is where it changes, he said again, and this time the words did not feel like a statement, they felt like a confirmation, because the change had already begun, and there was no going back. The moment did not end when the words were spoken, it deepened, settling into the structure of the space like something permanent, something that would not fade when the crowd eventually dispersed, and Marcus Ellington stood there with the same calm presence he had carried from the beginning. But now it felt different, not because he had changed, but because everything around him finally had. And the compliance team continued their work with quiet efficiency, moving between officers, collecting statements, confirming timestamps, building a record that would not rely on memory or interpretation, and Chief Reeves remained still, no longer at the center, no longer directing anything, just present within a process that no longer belonged to him. And that shift was visible to everyone, not in a dramatic fall, but in the absence of command where it had once existed, and Marcus watched it all without interruption. Because this was not about witnessing a person lose authority, it was about witnessing a system correct itself. And for a brief moment, the noise of the parking structure seemed to fade, replaced by something quieter, something reflective, and Marcus's gaze drifted slightly, not away from the scene, but inward, and the memory returned again, clearer this time, sharper, not just a moment, but a feeling, the weight of standing alone years ago in a similar space, the same kind of concrete walls, the same echo of footsteps, the same assumption delivered without hesitation. And back then there had been no compliance team, no oversight, no one stepping in to ask questions or document truth, just a quiet dismissal that left no record and no resolution. And Marcus had walked away from that moment carrying something invisible, something that did not show on the surface but shaped everything that came after: the decisions, the discipline, the refusal to be defined by someone else's assumption. And now, standing here, he felt the difference not as relief, but as clarity, because this was not about rewriting the past. It was about ensuring the present did not repeat it. And he blinked once, returning fully to the moment as one of the compliance officers approached him again, her posture steady, her tone unchanged. "We are expanding the review beyond this incident," she said, and the statement did not come as a surprise. Not to him. Not anymore. And Marcus nodded slightly, acknowledging the direction without needing further explanation, because he understood what that meant, not just for this unit, but for the system connected to it. And the officer continued, "Patterns like this do not exist in isolation." And her words aligned exactly with what had already been said, what had already been confirmed. And Marcus responded calmly. "That is why they go unnoticed for so long," he said. And the exchange, simple as it was, carried a weight that extended beyond the two of them, because it spoke to something larger, something that the crowd, still present, could feel even if they could not fully articulate it. And a man near the back lowered his phone completely now, his expression thoughtful, as if the moment had shifted from something to record to something to understand. And the woman who had been live streaming earlier slowly turned her camera away from Marcus and toward the broader scene, capturing the compliance officers, the documentation, the quiet restructuring of authority, because that was the story now, not just what had happened, but what was being done about it. And Chief Reeves finally spoke again, not loudly, not assertively, but carefully, his voice measured in a way it had not been before. "What happens next?" he asked, and the question, though directed at the compliance team, carried a different tone, one that acknowledged that he was no longer the one determining that answer. And the lead compliance officer looked at him directly, her expression composed. "The review will determine the scope of corrective action," she said, and the phrasing was precise, leaving no room for interpretation. And the chief nodded once, slowly, absorbing the response, because this was no longer about immediate outcomes. It was about process, about accountability that extended beyond the moment. And Marcus listened, without interruption, because this part mattered just as much as everything that had come before. Not the confrontation, not the exposure, but the follow-through. And he took a small step back, creating a slight distance between himself and the center of the scene, not to disengage, but to allow the process to continue without his presence defining it. And that was the difference, because this was never about him alone. It was about what his presence revealed. And the officer with the tablet approached again, her movement steady. "We will provide you with a full report once the initial findings are complete," she said to Marcus. And he nodded once, his response simple. "I expect transparency." And the words were not a demand. They were a standard, one that had already been set by everything that had happened. And she met his gaze. "You will have it," she replied. And the exchange closed a loop that had begun the moment he stepped out of that car. And around them, the crowd began to shift more noticeably now, some stepping back, others turning away, not because the moment had lost its importance, but because it had reached a point of resolution, not an ending, but a transition. And Marcus glanced once more at the car, the same reflection, the same stillness, but now it carried something different, not just presence, but proof. And he placed his hand lightly against it again, not as a claim, but as a quiet acknowledgement of everything it represented. And then he looked back at the scene one final time, at the officers, at the compliance team, at the chief who now stood within a process he did not control. And his voice, when he spoke again, was as calm as it had been from the beginning. "This should have been simple," he said, and the statement did not accuse, it clarified, and no one disagreed, because the truth of it was undeniable. And as the compliance team continued their work, and the structure of the situation settled into something new, something more aligned, Marcus Ellington stood there not as the center of conflict, but as the reason it had been revealed. And in that quiet, steady moment, the difference between assumption and accountability was no longer abstract. It was visible, it was recorded, and it was no longer going to be ignored. The structure of the moment had settled, but its impact had not. It continued to ripple outward, beyond the concrete pillars, beyond the gathered crowd, into systems that were now actively responding, and Marcus Ellington stood slightly apart from the center, no longer the focal point of scrutiny, but still the anchor of everything that had unfolded, and the compliance team moved with greater purpose now. Their earlier documentation transitioning into coordination, quiet conversations exchanged over secured devices, confirmations received, processes initiated that would not be visible to the crowd, but would carry far more weight than anything that had already happened. And Chief Reeves remained in place, no longer addressed directly, no longer directing anyone, his role reduced to presence within a process he did not control, and that shift was no longer subtle, it was defined, and one of the compliance officers stepped aside, speaking into her headset with measured clarity. Initial findings. Confirm procedural deviation at point of contact, she said, and though the words were technical, their meaning was clear. Something had been done incorrectly, not accidentally, but systematically, and Marcus listened without turning, because he understood the language, the structure behind it, the way systems spoke when they were correcting themselves, and a second officer joined her, reviewing data on a tablet, his brow tightening slightly as more information populated. There are multiple entries with similar flags, he said, and the phrase did not need elaboration. It connected directly to what had already been suggested, already been felt, and the crowd, though beginning to thin, remained attentive, because the story had shifted from a single moment to something broader, something that extended beyond what they had originally come to witness, and a man near the exit stopped walking, turning back as he heard the words, his phone still in his hand, still recording, because this was no longer just content, it was evidence, and Marcus took a slow breath, his gaze steady, and for a brief moment, he allowed himself to observe the entire scene as a whole, the officers now quiet, the compliance team in motion, the crowd transitioning from observers to witnesses, and he recognized something important, not about the situation, but about the shift itself, because this was what change looked like when it was real, not loud, not dramatic, but structured, recorded, irreversible. And he turned slightly as one of the compliance officers approached him again, her posture composed, her tone consistent. Mr. Ellington, the review is now extending to departmental oversight, she said, and the words carried a different weight, because this was no longer confined to one unit, one interaction. It was expanding into leadership, into policy, into the framework that allowed moments like this to exist in the first place. And Marcus nodded once, not surprised, not impressed, just acknowledging the direction, and he replied calmly, "That is where it should have started." And the officer held his gaze for a brief second before responding. "That is where it is going now." And the exchange closed a gap between expectation and action, and behind them, Chief Reeves shifted his stance, the subtle movement of someone who understood that the scope of the situation had now reached beyond him, beyond his immediate authority, and he looked toward the compliance team, his voice measured, careful. "Will I be notified of the findings?" he asked, and the question, though simple, carried a different tone now, one that acknowledged his position within the process rather than above it. And the lead compliance officer turned toward him, her response precise. "You will be informed through official channels," she said, and the phrasing was deliberate, formal, reinforcing the structure that had replaced his control, and he nodded once, slowly, absorbing the response without argument, because there was nothing left to argue, not in this moment, not with the direction the situation had taken, and Marcus watched the exchange briefly, then shifted his attention back to the broader scene, and something in his expression changed, not visibly to most, but subtly, internally, because this was the point where the moment transitioned fully from exposure to consequence, and he spoke again, not loudly, not to any one person, but to the space itself, his voice steady, clear. "This is what happens when assumptions are not questioned," he said, and the words settled into the structure of the moment, not as a conclusion, but as a definition, and one of the officers who had been present from the beginning looked up at him, his expression thoughtful, as if processing the statement not as criticism, but as reflection, and the compliance officer with the tablet stepped forward again, her screen now filled with data that extended far beyond the initial incident. We have identified a pattern of stops that follow. The same escalation sequence, she said, and the confirmation did not raise the tension, it grounded it further, because now the pattern was not implied, it was documented, and the crowd reacted again, not with surprise, but with recognition, a quiet understanding moving through them as the scope of the situation became clearer, and Marcus nodded slightly, his voice calm. Patterns do not form overnight, he said, and the officer responded without hesitation, which is why they require full review, and the exchange reinforced the process, the alignment between what had been revealed and what was now being addressed, and Marcus took one step forward, positioning himself once more beside the car, not to reclaim the moment, but to close the loop that had begun there, and he placed his hand lightly against the surface, the gesture steady, grounded, and he looked back at the compliance team, at the officers, at the chief, and then at the remaining members of the crowd, and in that moment, the space felt different, not because it had changed physically, but because its meaning had, and Marcus spoke one final time in that moment, his voice calm, deliberate, carrying through the structure of the space. "You thought this would end with me leaving," he said, and he paused just long enough for the contrast to settle. But it does not end there, and the words did not escalate the moment, they extended it, pushing it beyond the boundaries of the parking structure, into something that would continue long after the scene itself had cleared, and as the compliance team continued their work and the systems behind them continued to respond, the realization became clear to everyone still present. This was not just an incident that had been corrected, it was a process that had been activated, and once activated, it would not simply stop. The momentum did not slow, it expanded, moving beyond the physical boundaries of the parking structure into something larger, something that could no longer be contained within a single moment or a single location, and Marcus Ellington stood with the same composed presence. But now there was a different kind of weight around him, not pressure, but confirmation, as if everything that had been building for years had finally aligned into one visible point, and the compliance team continued their coordination, their voices low but constant, relaying information, confirming data, connecting this moment to others that had not yet been seen but were now being pulled into the light. And one of the officers stepped slightly away from the group, his phone pressed to his ear, his expression tightening as he listened. "Yes, it is confirmed," he said quietly, and though his words were not meant for the crowd, they carried just enough to signal that the situation had reached another level. And Marcus observed it all without interruption, because this was no longer about what had happened to him. It was about what was happening because of it, and Chief Reeves remained still, his earlier certainty replaced by something more measured, more contained, as if he was now fully aware that every action, every word, every silence was being recorded not just by cameras, but by systems that would not forget. And the lead compliance officer stepped forward again, her posture firm, her tone unchanged. "We have initiated a formal escalation to the City Review Board," she said, and the statement carried a different kind of finality, one that extended beyond immediate consequence into structured accountability. And Marcus nodded once, his expression steady, because this was the direction the moment had been moving toward from the very beginning, even if no one else had recognized it yet. And the officer continued, "This incident is now part of a broader investigation into enforcement patterns across multiple units." And the words settled into the space like a second wave, expanding the scope even further, and the crowd reacted again, not loudly, but collectively, a shift of understanding moving through them as the realization took hold. This was not isolated, this was not rare, this was something that had been happening, and was now being examined. And Marcus took a slow breath, his gaze moving briefly across the faces still present, the witnesses who had stayed long enough to see the moment transform into something meaningful, and then back to the compliance officer. "Make sure it is complete," he said, his voice calm but deliberate, and she met his gaze without hesitation. "It will be," she replied, and the exchange carried no tension, only alignment, because both understood what was required, and behind them, Chief Reeves shifted his stance again, his voice quieter now, more controlled. "I will cooperate with the investigation," he said, and the statement, though expected, carried a different tone now, not authority, not defense, but acknowledgement, and the compliance officer turned slightly toward him, her response precise. "You are required to," she said, and the clarity of it removed any ambiguity, reinforcing the structure that had replaced his command, and Marcus watched the exchange without reaction, because this was no longer about individual responses, it was about systemic correction. And one of the compliance officers approached him again, holding a tablet that now displayed more than just the immediate incident, data points, timelines, connections that extended beyond the visible moment. "We are mapping prior interactions to identify consistency," he said, and Marcus nodded slightly, his voice steady. "Consistency reveals intent," and the officer entered the statement without comment, because it did not need one, and the crowd, though smaller now, remained attentive. Those who had chosen to stay now fully invested not in the spectacle, but in the process. And a woman near the front lowered her phone completely, her expression thoughtful. "This is bigger than him," she said quietly, and the man beside her nodded. "It always was," he replied, and Marcus heard it, not directly, but enough to recognize the shift in perspective, because that was the point, not to center himself, but to expose something larger, and he stepped slightly forward again, repositioning himself not as the center, but as part of the structure that was now unfolding, and he spoke once more, his voice calm, measured. "This is what happens when systems are forced to look at themselves," he said, and the words did not challenge, they defined, and the compliance officer closest to him glanced up briefly, acknowledging the statement before returning to her work, and Chief Reeves looked toward Marcus for a moment, his expression no longer guarded, no longer defensive, just reflective, as if he was seeing the situation from a perspective he had not considered before, and for a brief second, the two of them stood there, not as opposing forces, but as participants in a moment that had moved beyond either of them individually. And then the chief looked away, his attention returning to the compliance team, because that was where the process now resided, and Marcus exhaled slowly, his posture relaxing just slightly, not because the moment was over, but because it had reached a point of stability. And he glanced once more at the car, the reflection. Still steady, still unchanged, and he understood something in that moment. Not new, but reinforced, that ownership was not just about possession, it was about presence, about standing in a space and refusing to be moved by assumptions that no longer held power. And he turned back toward the compliance team, his voice steady. "Keep the process visible," he said, and the lead officer nodded once. "Transparency is part of the directive," she replied, and the confirmation closed another loop, aligning expectation with action. And as the compliance team continued their work, and the structure of the investigation expanded beyond what anyone had anticipated at the start of this moment, the parking structure no longer felt like a place of accusation. It felt like a point of origin, the place where something had been revealed and could no longer be hidden, and Marcus Ellington stood there, not as someone who had been accused, not as someone who had been cleared, but as the reason the system had been forced to respond, and that response was no longer temporary. It was ongoing, structured, and impossible to ignore. By the time the next phase settled into place, the parking structure no longer felt like a scene. It felt like a record in progress, something being written in real time, not by narrative, but by systems that did not forget, and Marcus Ellington stood quietly beside his car, no longer the center of movement, but still the reason it continued. And the compliance team had shifted from initial review into full operational mode. Their devices synchronized, their voices low but constant, each instruction feeding into a larger structure that extended far beyond the concrete walls surrounding them. And one of the officers who had been present from the beginning stepped back another pace, his earlier posture replaced by something more reflective, as if the weight of the moment had finally reached him not as an event, but as something personal, something that could not be ignored once seen clearly, and Marcus noticed it, not with judgment, but with understanding, because change did not always begin with systems. Sometimes it began with a single moment of recognition that disrupted everything that had felt normal before, and nearby, The woman who had been live streaming lowered her phone completely, her screen still active but no longer her focus, her eyes now fixed on the compliance team. As they continued their work, and she spoke quietly to the man beside her, "This is not just about today," and he nodded slowly. "No, it never was." And their words carried softly through the space, reinforcing what had already become clear to those still present, that this moment had expanded beyond its origin, and Chief Reeves remained in place, his stance steady but altered, no longer leading, no longer directing, simply existing within a process that now defined his position rather than the other way around. And he looked toward the lead compliance officer, his voice measured. "What is the timeline for review?" he asked, and the question, though controlled, carried an undertone of something new, not urgency, not authority, but accountability, and the officer met his gaze briefly before responding. Compliance officer stepped forward again, addressing both Marcus and the chief, her voice clear. "This incident has been flagged for public transparency review," she said, and the phrase carried a different kind of weight, because it meant that what had happened here would not remain internal, it would not be contained within reports and files, it would be visible, accessible, part of a larger conversation that could not be controlled or redirected. And Chief Reeves exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just slightly, because he understood what that meant, not just for him, but for the department he represented. And Marcus looked toward the officer, his expression unchanged. "Good," he said simply, and the word did not carry satisfaction, it carried expectation, because transparency was not a favor, it was a requirement, and the officer inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the response before returning to her work, and Marcus took a slow breath, his gaze moving once more across the space, the officers, the compliance team, the remaining witnesses, and he recognized something important in that moment. Not about the situation itself, but about its impact, because this was no longer about correcting one action. It was about shifting perception, about forcing a system to see what it had been allowed to ignore. And he stepped forward slightly, positioning himself once more within the center of the space, not to reclaim attention, but to anchor the moment one final time. And when he spoke, his voice remained calm, steady, carrying through the structure of the parking area without effort. "This is what accountability looks like when it is not delayed," he said, and the words settled into the space with clarity, and no one interrupted, no one challenged, because there was nothing left to question, and one of the officers who had remained silent until now nodded subtly, as if acknowledging something he had not fully understood before, and the compliance team continued their work, their movements now more coordinated, more integrated, as the review expanded beyond the immediate scene into the systems that supported it. And Chief Reeves looked toward Marcus again, his expression no longer guarded, no longer defensive, just thoughtful, as if he was seeing the moment from a perspective he had not considered before. And for a brief second, their eyes met, and there was no confrontation there, no tension, just recognition of what had unfolded and what would follow. And Marcus did not hold the gaze, he let it pass, because this was not about individuals anymore, it was about what came next. And as the compliance team finalized their initial documentation and began transitioning into extended review protocols, the parking structure no longer felt like a place where something had gone wrong. It felt like a place where something had finally been seen clearly. And Marcus Ellington stood there, not as someone who had been questioned, not as someone who had been cleared, but as the reason the system had been forced to respond in a way it could not reverse, and that response would continue long after the moment itself had ended. The structure of the moment reached a point where movement slowed, not because the process had ended, but because it had taken hold, settling into systems that no longer required constant visible action to continue. And Marcus Ellington stood beside his car with the same steady presence. But now there was a quiet finality in the air, not an ending, but a transition from exposure to consequence that would carry forward beyond what anyone could see in that space. And the compliance team had shifted into a different rhythm, their earlier urgency replaced by controlled execution, finalizing initial reports, confirming data transfers, ensuring that everything captured in this moment would remain intact, unaltered, and available for the next phase. And Chief Reeves remained where he was, no longer central, no longer addressed directly. his role now defined entirely by the process surrounding him. And that realization had settled fully, visible in the way he no longer attempted to reclaim authority, no longer redirected attention, just stood within the framework that had replaced his command. And one of the compliance officers approached him again, her posture composed, her tone steady. "You will receive formal notice of administrative reassignment pending the outcome of the review," she said, and the words were delivered without emphasis, without judgment, just clarity, and the chief nodded once, slowly, absorbing the statement without resistance, because there was nothing left to resist, not when the structure itself had shifted beyond his influence. And Marcus watched the exchange quietly, his expression unchanged, because this was not about personal consequence. It was about systemic response, and one of the officers who had been present from the beginning stepped forward slightly, his voice hesitant but sincere. "Sir," he said, addressing Marcus. And for a brief moment, the entire space seemed to pause again, not out of tension, but out of attention, and Marcus turned his head slightly, meeting the officer's gaze, and the officer continued. "I should have checked first," he said, and the statement was simple, but it carried weight, because it acknowledged not just the moment, but the choice within it. And Marcus held his gaze for a brief second before responding, his voice calm. "That is where it begins," he said, and the exchange did not resolve anything. It did not erase what had happened, but it marked something else, recognition, the first step in a process that extended beyond policy and procedure into individual awareness. And the officer nodded once, stepping back, his posture different now, more reflective, and the compliance team continued their work, one of them speaking into a secure line. "Initial report compiled, forwarding to City Review Board," she said. And the words confirmed what had already been set in motion, that this moment would not remain here. It would move forward, through channels designed to examine, to evaluate, to determine what came next. And Marcus took a slow breath, his gaze moving briefly across the remaining members of the crowd, fewer now, but still present, still engaged, and he recognized something in their expressions, not curiosity, not surprise, but understanding, the kind that comes when something long ignored becomes visible in a way that cannot be dismissed. And the woman who had been live streaming earlier spoke again, this time without her phone raised, her voice steady. "This should not have needed a camera," she said, and a man beside her responded quietly. "But it needed a witness," and their words settled into the space alongside everything else that had been said, reinforcing the idea that this moment was not just about what had happened, but about what had been seen. And Marcus turned slightly, his attention returning to the compliance team, and the lead officer approached him once more, her posture formal, her tone consistent. "We will be in contact regarding the next steps," she said, and Marcus nodded once, his response simple. "Make sure it does not stop here." And she met his gaze directly. "It will not," she replied, and the exchange carried a quiet certainty, because both understood that this was not a single incident. It was part of something larger, something that required continuation, and Marcus stepped back slightly, creating space between himself and the center of the scene, not to disengage, but to allow the process to move forward without his presence defining it. And that was the difference, because this had never been about him alone. It had been about what his presence revealed. And Chief Reeves looked toward him one final time, his expression no longer guarded, no longer defensive, just reflective. And though he did not speak, the silence itself carried meaning, acknowledgement without words, and Marcus did not respond, because nothing needed to be said, not at this point, not after everything that had been made visible. And the compliance team began to consolidate their work, devices powered down, data secured, movements coordinated as they prepared to transition out of the space. And the parking structure, which had once held tension, now held something different, clarity, the kind that remains even after the moment passes. And Marcus turned toward his car, his hand resting briefly on the surface once more, the same reflection staring back at him, unchanged, steady, and he understood something in that moment, not as a realization, but as confirmation, that the power of the moment had never been in the confrontation, it had been in the exposure, in forcing something hidden into view. And he stepped toward the driver's side, the motion simple, unhurried, and as he reached for the door, he paused for just a second, glancing back at the space behind him, at the officers, at the compliance team, at the few remaining witnesses. And then he spoke one final time, his voice calm, clear, carrying through the now quiet structure. "This was never about proving who I am," he said, and he paused just long enough for the words to settle. "It was about showing what happens when you assume I am not." And the statement did not echo, it settled, becoming part of the moment itself. And as Marcus Ellington opened the door and stepped into his car, the scene did not feel like it was ending. It felt like it had already moved beyond this place, into something that would continue, structured, documented, and impossible to ignore. The engine did not start immediately, not because it could not, but because Marcus Ellington did not rush moments that mattered. And as he sat behind the wheel, hands resting lightly against the leather, he allowed the silence to settle one last time, not as tension, but as closure. And outside the car, the parking structure had already begun its quiet return to normal, the compliance team moving toward their vehicles with the same precision they had arrived with, their work no longer visible but far from finished, the officers dispersing slowly, their earlier certainty replaced by something more measured, more aware. And Chief Reeves remained standing for a moment longer than the others, his posture still, his gaze fixed somewhere ahead as if trying to understand the weight of what had just unfolded, not as a single event, but as a shift he could not reverse. And Marcus watched it all through the windshield, not with satisfaction, not with judgment, but with clarity, because this was never about witnessing someone fall. It was about watching a system finally see itself, and the woman who had been recording earlier stepped back toward the exit, her phone lowered now, her expression thoughtful, as if the moment had followed her inward, no longer something to capture, but something to carry. And a man beside her said quietly, "That changes things," and she nodded. "It has to," she replied, and their words lingered in the air even as they turned away, because they were not speaking about the scene, they were speaking about what it meant. And Marcus exhaled slowly, his reflection faint in the glass, steady, unchanged, and for a brief second, the memory returned again, not sharp, not painful, just present, the version of himself years ago standing in silence, no audience, no correction, no system stepping in, and he understood now that the difference was not time, it was intention, it was what had been built in response to those moments, not to avoid them, but to confront them when they came again. And as the memory faded, the present remained, clear, grounded, irreversible, and Marcus reached forward, pressing the ignition, the engine coming to life with a low, controlled hum that echoed softly through the structure, not disruptive, not aggressive, just present. And he placed his hands on the wheel, steady, deliberate, and for a moment, he did not move, because movement was no longer urgent, not after everything that had already been set in motion beyond this place. And outside, one of the compliance officers paused briefly near the exit, speaking into her headset. "All units confirmed. Initial phase complete. Proceeding to extended review," she said, and though her words were not directed at him, Marcus heard them clearly, and they carried exactly what this moment had become, not an ending, but a continuation. And Chief Reeves finally turned, walking slowly toward the far side of the structure, not escorted, not directed, just moving within a reality that had shifted around him. And Marcus watched him for a brief second before looking forward again, because this was not about following what came next for him. It was about what had already been set in motion for everything beyond this space. And the last of the officers began to leave, their presence fading into the background of the structure, and the parking area, once charged with tension, now held something quieter, something more permanent, the kind of clarity that does not disappear when the moment ends. And Marcus shifted the car into drive, the motion smooth, controlled, and as he began to move forward, the tires rolling slowly across the concrete, the sound grounding, steady, he passed the exact spot where everything had begun, the same space, the same lines on the ground, unchanged, but no longer the same in meaning, and he did not look down, he did not need to, because the moment had already been recorded, not just on cameras, but within systems that would not forget. And as he approached the exit, the light from outside began to filter in, brighter, wider, opening into a space that felt different from the one he had entered, not because the world had changed, but because something within it had been forced into view, and Marcus slowed slightly before the ramp, his gaze steady ahead, and he spoke quietly, not to anyone, not for anyone, but because the words belonged to the moment itself. I did not need to raise my voice, he said, his tone calm, certain. I only needed the truth to be heard, and the statement settled into the space inside the car, final, complete, and as he guided the vehicle up the ramp, the structure behind him began to fade from view, not erased, not forgotten, but left where it belonged, as the place where something had been revealed and could no longer be hidden. And above, the city continued as it always had, unaware of the specific moment that had just occurred, but already shaped by the systems now moving beneath it, and Marcus merged into the flow of traffic, the car steady, seamless, part of a larger movement that did not stop for any one moment. And yet, everything about that moment would continue, in reports, in reviews, in conversations, in decisions that would be made long after this drive. And as the building disappeared fully in the rearview mirror, Marcus did not look back again, because there was nothing left to confirm, nothing left to prove. The work had already begun, and it would not stop, and the only thing that remained was what he had known from the beginning, spoken now without hesitation, without weight, just truth. You mistook presence for permission, he said quietly, his eyes forward, and that was the only mistake that mattered. And the road ahead opened wide, steady, unchanged, but now carrying something different, not visible, not loud, but real, and impossible to ignore.